Welcome to a bit of history on insurance. If you're watching this video, you've probably already seen the history of level funded, or if you haven't, well, I really encourage you to do so after this four-part series. Today, we're going to chat about the history of insurance itself. Now, if you can tell by the smile on my face, I really enjoy this stuff, and I'm guessing if you're on this, you also enjoy insurance at its backbone. Now, we're going to establish something off the bat. And that is, where does insurance come from? What is insurance? A lot of people have different answers to that fundamental question. And although people have been working in this industry for a large part of their life, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have an answer to that they can defend. Now, the easiest answer, or the one that I think is the most all-encompassing and the most accurate, is insurance is a mechanism where the lucky many pay for the unlucky few. That is at its core what it really is. Now, inside of that, there are so much nuance. There is so much creative thinking and logical thinking that you can spend a lifetime digging into how society developed with insurance and insurance developed with society. It is my belief that you do not have a development of culture or of society without some type of insurance mechanism that allows the risk takers among us, and there's few, most people are very conservative, the risk takers among us to go out there, drive, strive, innovate, and deliver the very improvements that all of us take for granted in our modern life. The oil that lubricates that is the insurance business. Now, I hope you're as excited to talk about this as I am. It is something that we're dedicating our lives to, which is the fulfillment of one part of the insurance business. So with that, let's get into a bit of the deep, deep history of the insurance effects and the incentives that evolved to bring us to this part in our human history. A lot of people ask what insurance does. Well, outside of the very high level, it is the lucky many paying for the unlucky few. Insurance is a mechanism. Insurance is a mechanism where people bleed a little bit instead of bleeding out. What we found in human society is that you can apply a lot of principles together here. You have a 80-20 or Pareto principle of risk. You have cataclysmic events very rarely, but they are absolutely devastating to small areas. So what we've been able to do as societies have become larger and more broad is been able to highlight the fact that risk is everywhere, but actual claims are very rare, or they should be. So with that in mind, what risk does, or what insurance does, is allows the individual to pool so that they can have a reasonable assumption of not a cataclysmic failure, to be able to take the actions that are more or less inside of the two standard deviations, or that 80% side, you're going to be set. So instead of worrying about a flood and not investing in the new barn, you can invest in the new barn and realize that the flood's going to come once every 100 years, and you're going to pay 2% of the cost of that barn every year. So even if it does come through, you're going to be fine. The entire country of Holland would not have existed without the insurance mechanisms that were built by the windmills and the dike systems. These insurance mechanisms go back very, very far into human history. They go back so far that I believe they go back to the Walls of Jericho. Now, the Walls of Jericho, depends on who you ask, but in generally accepted history, the Walls of Jericho are the first substantial city walls built on the planet. Now, what did they represent? Well, the Walls of Jericho represented a big bifurcation between those inside of the walls and those outside of the walls. The inherent risk of theft and fire and bandits and armies and pillaging and that type of thing was bifurcated between the things that were inside of the city or protected by the walls and those that were outside of the city. So if you were, or the city walls, when you were storing goods, you would pay additional money. Those of you who are ahead of the class already know where I'm going with this. You would pay additional money to store your goods inside of the city walls. Now, you would do that because there's a reduction of risk to you. The benefit that you are accepting for being inside of the city walls is greater than the cost that you're willing to pay. You're bleeding a little bit so you don't bleed out. That is called a premium. And that goes all the way back to ancient history, to the foundation of Western society, or the foundation of our society, which is the bifurcation of a place between those inside of the walls and those outside. Those that are subject to, subject of, and citizens thereof. That wall, that protective area, and those that are the barbarians at the gates, those outside with less rule, less law, less order, and more, frankly, more theft, more risk outside of those city walls. That is a great way to think about that, but think about one other part of that. The people who invested in that were all of the people in there, and that was a fourth type of money that was utilized. They didn't have a choice whether to pay or not. Now, they benefited off the bat. After that first initial building that set up that society, the money then was used as a fourth type of money, which means the maintenance of it that people didn't have a choice of, and the maintenance of city walls was always inefficient. We think modern government was inefficient. So was ancient government. In fact, you can look at city walls as a great example of that. The Great Wall of China, although it took them forever to build, and it became a protective inside, and the Mongols on the outside are much more risky on the outside, was never conquered by going through it. It was conquered by people paying off the corrupt officials that maintained the gates. So think about this as a history of the incentives and the protective statuses of city walls and what they mean by inside of them and outside of them. As history progressed, there developed more and more nuance inside of the laws. And modern men, when we look at the world, we don't see this tiny little place as the Colossus that it once was. And that's the next big part of the history of insurance. A very small place called Rhodes. Now, Rhodes came up with an idea called Lex Rhodia. Lex Rhodia was a legal system that allowed for shipping and freight to be pushed around with a apparatus of risk sharing so that any one loss didn't absolutely, completely collapse the shipper. There was a way to buy and sell portions of risk inside of the shipping groups, which allowed people to invest more aggressively and not have their entire livelihood, their entire way that they fed their families and their children on the hook every time they went out there. Now, that was Lex Rhodia. That allowed a small island called Rhodes to build one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was a Colossus of Rhodes. That right there was based on an insurance program. Now, that insurance program lasted for many, many years, and it rose and fell with the level of trust or the level of brotherhood inside of that insurance agreement was effectively how good Rhodes was or how poor Rhodes was doing. And again, that was based on insurance. A lot of the insurance industry's history is based around maritime, as effectively they're able to use the third type of money or a higher class of money with greater efficiency rather than the fourth type of money, which is all based around the state. So private enterprise against state-based enterprise. Now, the next big hit inside of the insurance history or inside of our industry that affected everything were the great fires of medieval Europe. Now, we'll highlight this with London. And to the historians out there, I know medieval Europe ended before 1666. But in general, use this as a bifurcation. What the Great Fire of London said was that if you insure an individual house, then the effect of that is the people no longer worry as much about the fire codes of that specific house. Their worry is shifted. They've sold their worry, right? And they've given people money to take care of that worry. And generally that worked. And the fire brigades of medieval Europe worked fairly well, except when they didn't, except when the fire flew out of control. What ended up happening is that the king of London said, you can no longer use tar and pitch houses. You can no longer use timber. You have to use stone or stucco. But the people didn't listen. They also had a really funky little piece, which was the incentives of the king said that you pay your taxes based on the square footage of your footprint. So what are the builders incentivized to do? Well, they're incentivized to build up, but they're also incentivized to build over the cities, balconies and creep. So in medieval or pre-fire London, almost all of the buildings had creep. They had almost no sky between themselves when you're on the floor or on the street looking up. All of the buildings were creeping towards each other, so much so that you could jump across the alley, jumping balcony to balcony. Now, that was based on the taxes. Now, the king had made this illegal, but it wasn't enforced. It wasn't enforced until after the Great Fire of London. It wasn't the king's mandate. It was the fact that the individual business owners or the shop owners or the building owners couldn't actually insure their property without abiding by the king's codes. So insurance is private bureaucracy. Those two things together actually enforce compliance. or the consent of the governed, right? It wasn't just the king's mandate, of which I believe King Charles mandated that they were supposed to do it, but people didn't follow it, right? Because their incentives were not to. That increases my tax bill. Well, whenever they couldn't get protection for their building, they actually did comply. So with that, you have the expansion of a backbone or one of the pillars of the modern insurance world, and that is Lloyd's of London. Lloyd's of London, or Lloyd's Coffee House, came about at a single time when coffee and international trade and the bustle of modern commerce was at a fever pitch in the British Empire. So Lloyd's of London was a popular coffee house with the shipping captains. And as Lex Rhodia expanded to cover people inside of the pre-modern world, or the before Common Era, whichever term you want to use there, this was the modern world's new equipment, new facilitation vehicle to allow people to buy and sell portions of the trades. Now, most of them are still abiding by Lex Rhodia. But with that, they were able to buy and sell portions of the risk for each individual journey, each individual ship, and each individual cargo. And because of that, Lloyd's started to expand as international trade expanded. And that enabled the relationships to start to bloom all over the planet. Lloyd's went from a coffee house to new Lloyd's, or to old Lloyd's, which was more or less a gambling syndicate. With that, you have the final part that has really formed the large part of the history of our industry. And that was the development of reinsurance. Now, fits and starts in the reinsurance industry as global effects of war have also shaken down and affected the reinsurance industry. Inside of our industry, reinsurance really developed starting around the first wave of globalization, or pre-World War I. And it was the Brits, the Germans, the Swiss, and then a indirect link of the Brits via Hong Kong, the Brits via Singapore, and then the Japanese via Tokyo, that established the first major reinsurance risk operations. And if you think about reinsurance, because risk is everywhere, right? If you offer fire insurance in Cleveland and you only offer it in Cleveland, then a great city fire wipes you out. But if you take that and you say, I'm going to give up a portion of my premium, and I'm going to take on a portion of risk in South American grain, those are very non-connected. Now, if the more layers you put on that, the more Swiss cheese ends up looking like a solid block from the top. And that is effectively what reinsurance does. It takes the holes that are inherent in all risk and layers non-connected pieces onto it to make it stronger. It's effectively like taking a single strand of fiber and weaving it together. And so the net is much more strong. And that was truly started in the first wave of globalization, so 1890s to the build up to World War I. But since World War II, and especially since Bretton Woods, it has grown to a very broad, completely global marketplace. It is effectively the lubrication of commerce. People say bankers run the world. That may be the case. They move the big blocks of stone that are capital. But the skids that everything moves on, the wheels, the grease, is the insurance industry. People are much more willing to give up a percentage of a premium or percentage of profit to know that they won't be ruined. So whenever we think about the history of our great industry, we think about the history of insurance, realize that we are private bureaucracy. We are the third type of money that is much more efficient than the fourth type, but it still has the third type of money problem. With that, that's the first little bit of the history of insurance as I see it. I hope you got something out of this, and come back for the next one, which will cover the next bit of the history of our great business. We'll see you in a bit.